Have you ever gotten in a heated argument and maybe said something a little too intense and later you're kind of worried about how those words could be twisted? Like what if that offhand comment made in the heat of the moment actually landed you in court?
Oh, yeah.
That's the situation we're diving into today.
Hmm.
A case from the Philippines that really makes you think about the power of words and the burden of proof.
What's fascinating about this case is how it hinges on a single phrase in Ilocano,
Yeah.
"Patayan mi koman," which translates to, "we should have killed him."
Wow.
This phrase became the center of a legal battle with some pretty serious consequences.
We're talking about the case of Pedrito Garma y Miguel,
Okay.
also known as Willy versus the people of the Philippines.
All right.
You can find it under GR No. 248317, and the Supreme Court ruling came down on March 16th, 2022.
2022.
The charge: grave threats.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Sure.
To secure a conviction for grave threats under Article 282 of the Revised Penal Code, the prosecution had to prove not just that the words were spoken, but that they were spoken with the clear intention to intimidate the other person. It's not simply about what was said, but about the context, the intent behind the words,
Right.
and the actual impact on the person who heard them.
So we're going beyond just the literal interpretation of the words.
Exactly.
We have to dig deeper and ask, what was going through the speaker's mind?
Yeah.
Did they genuinely mean to instill fear, or were those words said out of frustration, anger, or even just as a figure of speech?
Exactly. And that's where things can get really tricky, especially when you factor in things like cultural nuances and the specific circumstances surrounding the interaction.
Well, let's set the scene for this particular case. It all started in a small village in Cagayan. Picture this. You've got a group of farmers loading a water pump,
Okay.
two brothers chasing after some fish thieves, and a barangay captain who's feeling very uneasy.
It sounds like the start of a good drama, but the stakes were actually quite high in this situation.
Absolutely. The two brothers, Pedrito and Reynaldo Garma, owned a fish pond in the village. They discovered that their fish pond had been vandalized, and they suspected that it was connected to a controversial water impounding project that was planned for the area.
Okay.
The Garma twins believed that this project would have a negative impact on their livelihood.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the barangay captain, Roseller Balan, was the one in charge of implementing that water project.
Right.
This automatically placed him in a position of conflict with the Garma twins who were opposed to the project.
So tensions were already running high between these parties.
Yes.
Then to make matters worse, the Garma twins caught some people illegally fishing in their fish pond.
Adding another layer of conflict to an already tense situation.
Exactly. As the twins were chasing after these fish thieves, they encountered those farmers we mentioned earlier, the ones working for Barangay Captain Balan. And this is where that key phrase comes into play. One of the farmers, Marlon Temple Jr., testified that during this encounter, Pedrito Garma uttered the phrase, "Patayan mi koman," while referring to Barangay Captain Balan.
And because of the existing tension surrounding the water project,
Yeah.
Barangay Captain Balan took this phrase as a direct threat to his life. He reported the incident to the police, and that's how this whole legal battle got started.
So from a seemingly simple encounter, a heated exchange of words, a case emerged that would go all the way to the highest court in the Philippines.
And it really highlights the power of words and the importance of context.
Yeah.
One phrase uttered in a specific moment can have a ripple effect that extends far beyond the initial interaction.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, he said those words. It sounds pretty straightforward,
Oh.
guilty, right?
Yeah.
But like we talked about, proving grave threats in a court of law is more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The prosecution needed to show that Pedrito Garma not only said those words,
Right.
but said them with the specific intent to make Barangay Captain Balan fear for his life.
Right. The legal term for that intent is mens rea. Okay.
The guilty mind, essentially. Without that, it's harder to prove the crime.
Yeah.
And that's where the Garma twins' defense comes in.
Okay.
They presented a very different version of events.
Okay.
They claimed that just a few days before this encounter at the fish pond, they were actually the victims of an assault.
Hold on. So they're saying they were targeted first.
Yes. They claimed that a group led by a barangay official confronted them and demanded proof of their property boundaries.
Oh, wow.
Then things escalated, and this group physically assaulted the twins.
Wow. So you can see why they might already be on edge by the time they encounter those farmers at the fish pond.
Absolutely. The Garma twins reported this assault to the police, but they claimed that nothing was done about it. Then, to add insult to injury, they discovered their fish pond had been vandalized the very next day.
And they believed all of this was connected to that water impounding project and those who supported it,
Right.
which included Barangay Captain Balan. Right. So their argument was that they were simply trying to find Barangay Captain Balan to report these incidents to him, not to threaten him.
Okay.
Any comment made, they said, was out of frustration with the situation, not out of a desire to intimidate.
So you've got two conflicting stories, two very different interpretations of the same events.
Yeah.
How did the lower courts handle this?
Well, initially, the municipal trial court sided with the prosecution and found Pedrito Garma guilty of grave threats.
Okay.
Their decision was based heavily on the testimony of that farmer, Marlon Temple Jr.,
Right.
and the fact that there was already known animosity between the Garma twins and Barangay Captain Balan.
It sounds like they focus more on the words themselves and the existing tension rather than trying to unpack the intent behind those words.
That's one way to look at it. And that this decision was then upheld by the regional trial court on appeal.
Okay.
They agreed with the municipal trial court's assessment of the evidence and the credibility of the witnesses.
So at this point, it's looking pretty bad for Pedrito Garma.
It might seem that way, but this is where it gets really interesting. The case went up to the Court of Appeals, and while they also upheld the conviction, they modified the sentence and acknowledged some potential issues with the prosecution's case.
Okay, so there's a glimmer of hope. What kind of issues did they find?
They pointed out that the main witness's testimony, the farmer who claimed to have heard the threat, contained some inconsistencies, especially around the timing of the alleged threat.
So they were starting to poke holes in that he said narrative.
Exactly. And because of these lingering doubts, the case ultimately landed in the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court of the Philippines.
And that's where things really take a turn, right? I mean, the Supreme Court doesn't just rubber stamp decisions from lower courts.
Right.
They really dig deep into the evidence and the legal arguments.
That's right. And in this case, they did exactly that. The Supreme Court scrutinized every detail, every piece of testimony, and they came to a different conclusion than the lower courts.
Okay.
And their reasoning is fascinating.
Well, don't leave us hanging. What did the Supreme Court find? How did they justify overturning the previous decisions? This is what we've been building up to.
Here's what happened. The Supreme Court zeroed in on the fact that the prosecution's version of events just didn't add up logically.
Okay.
They asked, would someone really stop in the middle of chasing down people they believe have wronged them to make a random threat to someone who isn't even present?
You're right. That does seem out of place. It's not the most logical sequence of actions, especially when adrenaline is pumping and you're trying to catch someone.
Exactly. The Supreme Court found it highly improbable that the Garma twins would have interrupted their pursuit to make this threat, especially since Barangay Captain Balan wasn't even there at the fish pond.
Yeah.
They basically said, this story doesn't hold water.
So they started to question the credibility of that key witness.
Yes.
The farmer whose testimony the whole case seemed to rest on.
Precisely. And to make matters worse for the prosecution, the other two farmers who were supposedly present during this encounter couldn't corroborate the story. If this was a genuine threat meant to intimidate, wouldn't those other witnesses have a clear memory of it?
Seems like a pretty big oversight on the prosecution's part.
The Supreme Court thought so, too. They also pointed to the fact that even Barangay Captain Balan admitted that this was the only instance where he felt threatened by the Garma twins.
Oh.
It wasn't like they had a history of harassing him or making threats.
Which makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, this one phrase was taken out of context or blown out of proportion because of the pre-existing tension over that water project?
That's a valid point. And this all goes back to the crucial legal concept of reasonable doubt, which the Supreme Court emphasized in their ruling.
Reasonable doubt, that cornerstone of the justice system. But what does it actually mean in practice? How did it apply to this specific case?
Think of it this way. Imagine you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle and you're missing a crucial piece.
Okay.
You might have a strong suspicion about what the overall picture is, but without that missing piece, can you be absolutely certain? In this case, the Supreme Court found that the prosecution's case had too many missing pieces, too many inconsistencies, and too much reliance on a single witness whose story didn't quite hold up under scrutiny.
So they were basically saying, we have doubts about the prosecution's version of events, and those doubts are reasonable enough to prevent us from convicting Pedrito Garma.
You got it.
Wow.
And that's ultimately why they decided to acquit Pedrito Garma, overturning the decisions of all the lower courts.
Wow. Talk about a legal roller coaster.
Yeah.
But this really highlights the importance of having a system of checks and balances in the justice system.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court plays a crucial role in ensuring that justice is served not just by upholding convictions, but also by scrutinizing the evidence and protecting the rights of the accused.
Absolutely. And the concept of reasonable doubt is central to that mission. It's not about proving absolute innocence.
Right.
It's about ensuring that the prosecution has presented a case that is so strong, so convincing, that there is no other reasonable explanation for the events in question.
And in this case, the Supreme Court found that the prosecution's case, while it might have raised suspicions, didn't meet that high bar of proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
And that's why Pedrito Garma was acquitted.
Yeah.
The court, in its wisdom, decided it was better to err on the side of caution, prioritizing the principle that it's better to let a guilty person go free than to convict an innocent person based on shaky evidence.
So after all that legal back and forth, we finally have a resolution. But this case really makes you think, doesn't it?
It certainly does. This case isn't just about one man and one phrase.
Yeah.
It raises some pretty big questions about the power of words, the importance of context,
Right.
and the challenges of interpreting intent, especially in emotionally charged situations.
I mean, think about it. What if you were on that jury? Would you have voted to convict based on the evidence presented? It's not an easy question to answer, and that's what makes this case so compelling.
It forces us to grapple with the complexities of language and the fact that words can have different meanings and different impacts depending on who's saying them, who's hearing them, and what the surrounding circumstances are.
It's a reminder that we can't just take words at face value. We have to consider the context, the intent, and most importantly, ensure that justice is served based on solid evidence and a clear understanding of what truly transpired. It really makes you think about how one little phrase can have such major consequences.
It does. It's kind of like a microcosm of how our words can impact others.
Yeah, and it reminds us that the justice system isn't perfect.
Definitely. Not every case is black and white.
It's more like shades of gray.
Exactly. There are always multiple perspectives and interpretations to consider.
So after this deep dive into the case of Pedrito Garma, what are your takeaways? What really stands out to you?
I think the biggest thing for me is the reminder that context is everything. You can't just look at words in isolation. You have to consider the whole situation, the relationships, the history.
Right. It's like that saying, words can be weapons.
Yeah, it's about understanding the power of language and using it responsibly.
This case also shows how important it is to have a strong defense.
Oh, absolutely. The Garma twins were lucky to have lawyers who dug deep into the evidence and challenged the prosecution's narrative.
It's a reminder that everyone deserves a fair trial, regardless of the accusations against them.
And that the principle of reasonable doubt is a cornerstone of our justice system.
It's there to protect the innocent and to ensure that convictions are based on solid evidence, not just suspicion or speculation.
Exactly. It's better to err on the side of caution than to risk condemning an innocent person.
Well said. So what do you think our listeners should take away from this deep dive?
I think it's a call to be more mindful of our words and to recognize that even seemingly harmless statements can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, and to always be willing to question what we hear, to dig deeper, and to consider all sides of a story.
Because justice is a complex and nuanced process, and it requires all of us to be engaged and informed.
This has been a fascinating discussion with lots to think about. What are your thoughts? Share your reactions, your questions, and let's keep the conversation going.
We'd love to hear from you.
Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the cases that matter, the stories that make us think critically about the world around us, and the legal principles that shape our society. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.